Today on Know the Truth from Philip De Courcy.
Joseph teaches us, and we all need to learn this, do we not? There is an upside to down. The big picture, the big principle is that God is sovereign. And what people do to us, even the evil, can be turned to good. God is so sovereign. There's such a thing as a good bad.
Back in April, we launched a brand new study on Know the Truth, and today we've arrived at the final message in this series. It's called Severe Mercy, a study on the life of Joseph. To get the 19 messages, you can go to ktt.org. Today we'll be looking at the final hours of Joseph's life. We'll be reminded, even in the hard moments of life, even when there's a funeral, we can see God's sovereign hand. Let's listen now. Here's Philip De Courcy, teacher and pastor of Kindred Church in Anaheim Hills, California.
Turn to Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50 and verse 22. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house. And Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were also brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land, to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him. And he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Our series on Joseph, after many months, has come to an end. June's dad, Gordon, in Scotland, has often commented to us that saying goodbye, which we've had to do with them and my own parents many times, saying goodbye is a little like dying. That's a true statement. Parting ways with someone or something that has been a good experience is never a good thing. And so it is in our studies in the life of Joseph. This sermon is the capstone on the series, and Joseph has certainly proven to be a good friend. And we really don't want to part with our old friend Joseph. But as a good friend, like all good friends, he has left us better friends with God, hasn't he? He's encouraged our trust in God. He's brought us to worship a God of sovereign care and sovereign control. His story has interested us. I think Joseph's story is a captivating, compelling story. It's the stuff a good action movie is made of. The cast of characters are engaging and interesting. The reality is raw, and we connect with the betrayal and the temptation and all that Joseph went through, his disappointment in the prison, his waiting for a better day. And like all good movies, we're left with a feel-good ending. And that's where Joseph ends, with the sovereignty of God bringing him to a place of triumph and supremacy in Egypt. All things work together for good. And in a sense, in a theological sense, we have a happy ending here. And so his story has interested us, and his steadfastness has inspired us. I mean, in adversity, he wasn't soured. And in prosperity, he wasn't spoiled. As James Montgomery Boyce, a commentator on Genesis, has noted, Joseph was a man for all seasons. You know, he had a faith that overcame the world. He was more than a conqueror, to borrow Paul's expression in Romans chapter 8. And I think we're attracted to this man. You would expect him to be crushed. You would expect his faith and trust in God to be pulverized and ground down to nothing, but that's not the case. Joseph continues to trust God. Joseph's trust in God triumphs over disappointment and over despair, over opposition, over evil perpetrated against him. His story has interested us. His steadfastness has inspired us to be more than conquerors through Christ who loves us. We can rest in the knowledge that all things work together for good. God can be trusted in the worst of times, when you and I feel that life is caving in. Like old Spurgeon said, where you cannot trace the hand of God, you can trust the heart of God. And Joseph has taught us that. His story has interested us. His steadfastness has inspired us. And so this is a life that's been worth looking into, hasn't it? And what we're going to learn in our capstone concluding study, that in death, Joseph's life continues to be interesting and instructive. We started to look at these verses towards the end of the book under the rubric of the matter of life and death. This is where the story of Joseph ends, with his burial, with his death. And we sought to cover two aspects of the end of this man's life: the matter of his life and the principle that governed it. We saw that the principle of Joseph's life is Genesis 50, verse 20. But as for you, you meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good. The principle that governed his life was the trust he had in the sovereignty of God. Joseph teaches us, and we all need to learn this, do we not? There is an upside to down. Maybe you're on a down slide or a down slope in your life. Things are not what you want them to be. What's the principle out of Joseph's life? The big picture, the big principle is that God is sovereign. And what people do to us, he does something with what they do to us. Even the evil can be turned to good. God is so sovereign. There's such a thing as a good bad. There's such a thing as a good bad, so much so that James can tell us, the half-brother of the Lord Jesus, that you can count it all joy when you fall into various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith will produce something. If you'll let God work in you and through you by all that's going on around you. That's the principle of his life. There is an upside to down, and we saw that in the light of God's sovereignty, we should never underestimate the influence of the individual, and we should never throw away the importance of the incidental. But God alone would remind us that our darkest moments are but short corridors, to quote Barnhouse, that lead to sunlit rooms. And some of us are in those corridors, and we need to hold on to the reality that there is an upside to down. The principle of this man's life is trust in the sovereignty of God. So we want to move from we're looking at the matter of life and death. We've looked at Joseph's life. The principle of his life is God's sovereign control of the affairs of his people. But let's move on to the prospect of his death. And then this we'll see the hope that you and I find through trusting in the promises of God's word that brings us to hopeful expectation. Let's kind of pick up then here in verse 22. So Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. And then in verse 24 we read, and Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying. Okay, we're right at the end of the story. The man who had saved thousands from death, like we'll all find, ultimately cannot save himself from death. The Bible is very clear about the inevitability of death. It comes to kings, it comes to subjects, it comes to the great, it comes to the small. It comes to all of us that is appointed unto man once to die. And you and I would want to be cognizant of that fact, that indeed, even in living, we are dying. And you and I must face the prospect of our own deaths. In fact, the book of Genesis, says John Phillips in his commentary on Genesis, is one vast graveyard One great handbook of funeral sermons, one long obituary. We have stood, he says, by the mutilated corpse of Abel. We have read the register of births and deaths in chapter 5 and attended the burial of a race in the flood. We have been to the funeral services of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Ishmael. We have wept with Jacob at Rachel's tomb. We have missed this one and that. Where's Rebecca? Where's Terah? Where's Lot? And always the answer comes, they're dead. Because it's in Genesis we learn what Paul will teach us in the book of Romans. By one man's sin, death entered the world, and death passed upon all men. And here we have, right at the end of this book, another funeral service. And we are reminded of the inevitability of death. And it's a good thing to live with your death in mind. It adds depth and definition, and it adds importance and impetus to all that you do. In fact, I had a pastoral friend back in Northern Ireland who told me of a friend of his who was called by a certain lady in his church, the daughter of an old man who was seriously ill, and she anticipated the demise of her father. And so she began to make funeral arrangements. But it was all a little early because he rallied and there was no funeral. And he lived for some time after that. And many months after that, the pastor engaged this girl in a conversation and almost laughed at the fact that they had, were ready to bury this man. And supposedly the daughter replied, "Pastor, that old man of mine wouldn't oblige anybody." Well, that aside, death is obligatory for all of us, apart from the return of Jesus. And so, as looking at Joseph's life, I think we want to be instructed as we look at Joseph's death. The principle of his life, the prospect of his death. Now, there's two things, his belief and his burial. But before we even get there, here's what I want you to note. This is important. Go over with me to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11 is being called the Westminster Abbey of the Bible. Here we have a list of those who died in faith, who trusted in God, who believed to see that which as of yet had not been seen, because faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And Joseph makes the register. Joseph makes the roster. But what's interesting, of all the events in his life that might exemplify and express faith, it's his death that gets a mention in Hebrews 11. You notice that? Go to Hebrews 11, verse 22. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, they cut out his whole life. As interesting and as intriguing as his life is, it's an amazing story. It's the stuff Hollywood movies are made of. And at many great junctures in his life, his faith in God was expressed in a marvelous way that certainly would bear mentioning in a chapter like Hebrews 11. But no, it's his death. When he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. I think that's interesting. The crowning expression of his faith was not in life, but in death. And is that not true? When it comes to our death, that needs to be the moment we express that crowning faith in Jesus Christ and the promises of God's word and the expectation of the hope we find in God. And it is striking. I mean, you and I could stop, the DVD at any point in the story of this guy's life and say, wow, what faith, overcoming faith, triumphant faith, faith that doesn't stagger in the face of opposition. But actually, the DVD's wound forward right to the end. The Bible says, hey, he was a man of faith, and most especially at the moment of his death. Which brings us then to look at his belief and his burial. A couple of, I think, very helpful things will come out of this. Okay, let's acknowledge his belief. What is his belief? We might change that to hope or expectation. Joseph died with a certain expectation. He was going to be initially buried in Egypt. But he knew the rest of the story. He had heard from his father and from his grandfather. The Bible isn't clear about this, but there's every reason to believe that Joseph probably as a boy lived towards the tail end of his grandfather's life, Isaac. So he may have heard this directly from Isaac, but will not conjecture too much. He certainly heard it from his father Jacob. And it was that there was a land promised to the people of God, to the descendants of Abraham. We read about that in Genesis 13, as God promises Abraham a land. And that is reiterated and reinforced to Isaac in Genesis 26, and then it is reinforced to Jacob in Genesis 28. There's also, in between the prophesying of those promises, looking forward to that prospect, this acknowledgement that for a time, before that all comes to fulfillment and fruition, the people of God will sojourn in a land of strangers. Okay? Go back with me to Genesis chapter 15. As God speaks to Abraham, the very years that Joseph will spend in Egypt along with his brothers. Remember, we said at the beginning of this whole series that one of the roles of Joseph's life is to build a bridge between Genesis and Exodus. And so in Genesis 15, verse 13, here's what we read. Then he said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions." There's a prophecy of the Exodus. Okay? Genesis ends with Joseph's death. Exodus begins with, "And a Pharaoh grew up who knew not Joseph." The good years are coming to an end. Israel has grown in the land of Goshen. Remember, we saw the providence of God, that they were given the land of Goshen right on the border of Egypt, so that when the Exodus takes place, they're out of there fast. But God knew all that was going to happen, and so did Joseph. He had heard it from his father, who had heard it from his grandfather, who had heard it from his great-grandfather. And so Joseph dies with this belief, and he expresses it here. "I'm dying," verse 24 of Genesis 50, "but God will surely visit you and bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, parenthesis, my father." And Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." In fact, Jacob gives a hint of this, doesn't he? In Genesis chapter 48 and verse 21, "Then Israel," or Jacob, "said to Joseph, 'Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers.'" So Jacob expresses belief at the moment of his death. He has spent 93 years of his 110 years in Egypt, but he knows that's not going to be his final resting place. And so he expresses a belief in the promise of God. And he's buried with that belief. He's buried expressing that confidence that God will visit. You see this verb twice in verse 24 and verse 25. It speaks of divine intervention. And where you find it, especially in the Pentateuch, it's talking about God's intervention for the sake of blessing or cursing. You're either going to be visited with blessing or you're going to be visited with cursing. And in the best of circumstances, as Israel obeys God, God will visit them, bless them, and curse their enemies. And that's what he's going to do with the Egyptians. We've already read that prophecy. God's going to judge the land of the strangers. And Joseph sees it coming. God's going to visit, intervene, bless you, curse them, and you're getting out of here after 400 years. Now, they lose sight of that, okay? Because they're very hesitant to take Moses and all of that, but Joseph certainly had not lost sight of it, and so he's buried with this belief. Let me just say something about his burial. Look at it in verse 26. "So Joseph died being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and they put him in a coffin." The embalming process, in a sense, he was mummified. The Egyptians were good at this. And then his body would have been kind of smeared over with a gummy residue or substance, and he may have been wrapped in some kind of gauze or cloth. And then it says he's embalmed and put in a coffin. The Hebrew word here is aron. And interestingly, it's used of the Ark of the Covenant. So don't be thinking of a kind of pine box. Remember, this is the death of a man of great importance in the land of Egypt. And he's buried with, I would say to some degree, with some state fanfare. He's embalmed, and then he's probably put in this ornate coffin. Don't be thinking pine box. Think of a sarcophagus, something like a chest or a box. It's the same word's going to be used for the Ark of the Covenant. And so I don't know where Joseph's sarcophagus sits. It's unlikely it was buried in the ground. It may have sat in different places. And one would want to believe that during the time of imprisonment and slavery and bondage, because that's coming, right? Exodus 1. Joseph knows it's coming, and he makes them swear, hey, when the Exodus comes, remember to take me out of here. That to some degree, Joseph's bones would have been a constant reminder to them in the dark days and the despairing times and the disappointing times that the sons of Jacob had been promised a promised land. He died with that belief. It seems that the people of God at times lost sight of that, and maybe the sight of his coffin, his box, his chest would remind them that here's a man who died in the belief that God would honor his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that the people of God mustn't lose their faith, their confidence, or their expectation of God. One would want to believe that Joseph's grave or the burial site or wherever it was resurrected the spirit of the Hebrew people at times. Remember what I taught Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember what Joseph said. Hey, bury me here, but you know what? This isn't my final resting place, nor yours. You're sojourners, aliens, and strangers. We're getting out of here someday. The good times will become bad times, but it won't stay bad. And you're going to get out of this place with great possessions. Genesis 15.
Joseph held an eternal perspective even in the final moments of his life. You're listening to Know the Truth with Bible teacher and pastor Philip De Courcy. Be sure to join us again tomorrow as we continue exploring today's powerful topic, the matter of life and death. This series, Severe Mercy, will conclude tomorrow. And if you're thinking of someone who needs to hear today's message, go to ktt.org. You can also hear today's message on the KTT app and on our podcast. Grab your smart device and search your favorite app or podcast store for Know the Truth with Philip De Courcy, and then hit the download or subscribe button. Like we've been talking about today, in challenging times like these, it's important to ground our hearts in the promises of God. That's why when you give to support Know the Truth, we'd like to say a big thank you by sending you an amazing book called Therefore I Have Hope, 12 Truths That Comfort, Sustain, and Redeem in Tragedy, by author Cameron Cole. He and his wife's faith was challenged when their 3-year-old son died suddenly. In weaving together their own story of tragic loss and abiding faith, Cameron explores these 12 life-giving truths to offer hope and comfort to those in the midst of tragedy. Today you can receive this book with your gift of any amount to Know the Truth. Join us in bringing hope and truth to searching hearts all over the world. Call 888-644-8811 or visit ktt.org. I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us tomorrow when Pastor Philip concludes his message, The Matter of Life and Death, Wednesday on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."